Okay, so now we have the three categories of torts: intentional torts, negligence, and strict liability. So now let's go through them a little bit and look at the elements. What is an intentional tort? One obvious intentional tort is a battery, someone who improperly touches somebody else, generally hits somebody else in some way or another. So what are the elements of the prima facie case there? The defendant has to act in a manner that causes harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff's person. Second, the defendant has to intend to do that. That's the intentional tort part. And third, there has to be causation, that the contact causes the particular harm. And contact could include contact to anything connected to a person: clothing, a bag, if you hit someone with a stick, that would count, and so forth. All we need are contact, intent, causation. Now, what about intent? Well, when we think about intent, there's two different kinds of intent that you might have. One is an intent to do the touching, to do the contact, and the other is an intent to actually create a harm. So, for example, I might, tap you on the back really, really hard just because I want to get your attention. I wasn't meaning to hurt you, so I intended to tap you, but I didn't intend to hurt you. So the question is, which kind of intent is good enough for an intentional tort suit? And what courts say is it's simply the intent to do the action. So you don't have to have the intent to harm someone, but if you intend to tap the person and the tapping causes the harm, that's an intentional tort. Now, if you didn't intend to tap at all and you just accidentally bumped into the person, that wouldn't be an intentional tort. But the point is, you don't have to have the specific intent to harm someone. You only need to have the general intent to make contact, to do the action. Now, there's also assault. And in common parlance, we often refer to assault and battery. You may have heard that phrase, but they actually are two different things. Battery is the actual contact. Assault is just when someone makes someone else fearful that there's about to be contact. So here, the defendant only has to act in a way that gives the plaintiff a sense that there's a reasonable apprehension that there's going to be imminent harmful or offensive contact. The defendant has to intend to cause such apprehension, and the defendant has to actually feel the apprehension. So that's the causation. So again, there has to be an action that causes the reasonable apprehension, and the defendant has to intend to cause it, and those are the elements of the prima facie case. And remember, this is expectation, not fear. So, for example, I might think that you are about to hit me, and it's possible that I'm not afraid, but that's still an assault if I think you're about to hit me. And if it's reasonable that I think you're about to hit me, that would be an assault. So words can be can create that kind of apprehension, but usually words are going to be combined with something else. So if I say something like, I'm going to hit you someday, that's not good enough. But if I say, I'm going to hit you, and I simultaneously raise my fist, then that would be good enough for assault. There is also a notion of transferred intent in both assault and battery, and that only means if I intend to commit a tort against one person, but I actually commit a tort against a different person, or I commit a different tort against the same person, or I commit a different tort against a different person, the intent follows over. So the classic example is I intend to shoot one person, but I have bad aim and my bullet actually hits somebody else. That is a transferred intent, and I would still be liable for battery with regard to that second person. Another intentional tort is intentional infliction of emotional distress. And that occurs when a person intends to cause this extreme emotional distress to someone else. Now, assault is an example of something that could also be an intentional infliction of emotional distress. But there might be other kinds of outrageous conduct, perhaps conduct that's purely verbal, where someone is not in imminent fear that they're going to be hit, but they may nevertheless be put into a position of emotional distress. And so if you intentionally do some sort of extreme or outrageous conduct, that conduct is intended to cause emotional distress in someone and does in fact cause the emotional distress, then that would be the elements for a prima facie case of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Now, in defense of an intentional tort, the defendant can raise a number of affirmative defenses. And you'll remember we talked about affirmative defenses earlier in this course. The affirmative defense is something that the defendant has to come forward and plead and prove. So once the plaintiff has made his or her prima facie case that there's an intentional tort going on, the defendant can say, yes, I did everything that you said, but I have a defense. And so when we look at defenses to intentional torts, these are things that the defendant actually has the burden of proof on. That's why they're called affirmative defenses. They're things that the defendant affirmatively has to prove. One would be consent. So obviously, if I touch you in some way that causes harm, but I only touched you because you told me I could, that would be a defense, even though you might have been harmed in the end. Consent can be express or implied, and to figure out whether somebody implicitly consented, you have to look again at what a reasonable person would think was consent. The defendant's actions also might constitute self-defense or defense of others, and that would be another area where if a person reasonably believes that whatever actions they're taking are necessary to protect themselves or others from imminent harm, then they can take proportional actions. Obviously, you can't be way out of proportion. Somebody comes at me with a stick and I take out a gun, might not be in proportion, that sort of thing. But in general, self-defense is a potential affirmative defense to an intentional tort, as well as defense of others. And there again, you're trying to defend somebody else, but again, it has to be imminent harm. If you can go and call the police and get a restraining order to protect yourself, then you really need to do that.